somebody out there do this, okay? Well, I began hearing about the Virden mine battle back in 1952 at the Virden Centennial. I was 10 years old at the time, so subtract 10 from 52, and I was born in 1942. I never thought I'd live this long. I'm 81. My parents were gone before this age, and my brothers are gone. But what I'd like to tell you today is three things, I guess, or three points. I'm going to give you some facts about the Virden mine battle, talk about some of the myths that surround the battle. Lastly, and maybe most importantly, some of the consequences of the battle. So let's start with some of the facts. Well, I'll bet some of you don't know where Virden is. Probably most of you do, but if you don't, it's a little town about the size of Gillespie in the northeastern corner of the county. As the crow flies, it's about 30 miles north of here. Virden was incorporated in 1852 and had a coal mine by the late 1860s. It's located between two county seats, Carlinville and Springfield. By 1893, the big guys in the coal business had spotted Virden. And here's the simple story why. We have 320 feet beneath the ground in Virden, a seam of coal about 7 to 7.5 feet deep that has a pretty good roof on it and doesn't get very damp. So the guys that wanted to make money decided this was a perfect spot for a coal mine. The United Mine Workers of America also organized about the same time that coal mine went in business. They date back to 1890 and 91 were kind of the organizational years, if I remember right, on the UMWA. And one of their big challenges in the 1890s was to try and boost what was then the sinking wages of miners. I better depend on a note here. In the 1880s, miners were making 80 cents a ton delivered to the top, and that price sunk to 32.5 cents a ton by the late 1890s. Quite a pay cut, wasn't it? We don't really understand that today. We think everything just goes up and up. Costs we know go up, and sometimes wages keep up. But this was a different economic situation. I wanted to add the footnote on the Virden mine that it was a shipping mine. Illinois had about 800 coal mines in the 1890s. In other words, most towns had, if they were real coal towns, might have had multiple mines, maybe 2 or 3 or 4. Virden had 3 in operation eventually at one time. But this Chicago Virden Coal Company produced enough coal to ship coal, primarily into the Chicago area where the corporate headquarters was. They were able to find contracts and ship coal in that direction. I found out that down here in the south end of the county, most of the coal produced by shipping mines was sent to the St. Louis area. But Virden was kind of on the dividing line and shipped to the north for whatever that's worth. So the UMWA decided to try and increase the wages of miners. And as most of us know, on July 4th, 1897, the Great Coal Strike began with an effort to increase wages from 32.5 to 55 cents a ton. Not as high as it had been, but at least going in the right direction. In January of 1898, 6 months after the strike began, Illinois operators and miners agreed to 40 cents a ton, kind of midway there, a compromise. It's not something that the politicians are too good at anymore, is compromise. But I was kind of raised with the idea that a half a loaf is better than none. And now, well, I don't even want to get started on that topic. I'm an old politician myself. Okay, so this new scale wage of 40 cents a ton was accepted by 776 of the state's 800 mines. 97% said we can live with that 40-cent hike, 32.5 to 40. The Virden mine was one of the 24 that said no, we will not pay 40 cents a ton. And the terms of the agreement said that if you were a miner at one of these 24 mines that did not accept the new scale wage, you had to approve of going back to work at less than 40. The Virden miners said they would not go back to work for less than scale wages. So guess what? They were locked out of work. On April 1st, 1898. They had been out for about 9 months, and little did they know that they were going to be out another 6.5 months. Imagine 15.5 months without a paycheck. After April 1st, probably the most important thing to know about the Virden mine battle is that Illinois did have a state arbitration board that ruled for the miners, said they deserved the pay hike to 40 cents. But guess what? The state arbitration board could not render a binding decision. Again, Fred Lukens, the owner of the Virden mine, said, thank goodness I'm not going to pay it. What does he do? He locks the doors, as we mentioned, and Lucas eventually decided to replace the 400 Virden miners that began the strike and were now locked out. So he advertised for replacement workers in Birmingham, Alabama, and he aimed the ad at African American miners, of whom there were many in Alabama. He found 105 takers, 100 family members accompanied them, and they left Birmingham in early October of 1898, bound for Virden. My feeling is that they were duped. They had no idea what they were getting into. And guess again here, how much do you think Lukens offered them? He was paying 32.5. He refused to pay 40, 30 cents a ton, and he found takers. So here's quickly the story of the battle. At St. Louis, the train bearing the strikebreakers picked up 75 Teal Detective Agency armed guards, carrying the best weapons available at the time. There were already 75 armed guards at the mine in Virden, where Lukens had built a stockade, or you could say a fort, around the mine. It's kind of shaping up as a bad situation. As the train approached town, it was told to stop and let the replacement workers off the train right in front of the mine. The first casualty occurred at the railroad station downtown in Virden, where a Chicago and Alton Railroad detective was killed. Between downtown and the mine, which kind of sits on the northeast corner of Virden, firing broke loose like we can't imagine. There were approximately 1,200 armed miners, 400 from Virden and about 800 more from the surrounding area. And Mount Olive provided a pretty good number as well. Probably about 50 to 75 of those 800 were from Mount Olive. But they came from Girard, Springfield, Taylorville, anywhere within about 40 or 50 miles of Virden to support their locked out brothers. At the mine site, in about 15 minutes time, there were 13 people killed. Doesn't sound like very many, does it, compared to a Civil War battle, but compared to other battles, of smaller scale battles, that's a lot of people killed in a few minutes. Many, many more were wounded. There's no good count on them, but conservatively 40, maybe up to 75 or 100 were wounded. We've got the list of the names over here of the Virden martyrs. Now I would tell you that surprisingly and interestingly to me as a Virdenite, no one from Virden was killed at the Battle of Virden. They were all from around the area. So how did the state deal with what was going on in Virden? The state militia, or Illinois National Guard, which had been in Pana, where there were also problems, was dispatched to Virden by Governor John Tanner. When the Guard reached Virden, both sides were disarmed. Everyone was sent home, whether they lived in Virden or Mount Olive or wherever, home. The saloons were closed, and hundreds of members of the Guard set up camp on the Virden town square for several weeks. So in other words, Virden was under martial law for about a month after the Virden mine battle. You can imagine that there was lots of blame going on. The company blamed the governor. Why? Because he did not send in the Guard earlier to help get the miners off to train. It was expected that a Republican governor would do that, but Tanner refused, and he had let his feelings be known to the Chicago Virden Coal Company officials. The governor, interestingly enough, was indicted by the Macoupin County jury that said, we agree that you have not done your duty as governor, and we want to try you down here in Carlinville. And guess what? The governor had to go to Carlinville and defend himself, but eventually the charges were dropped. But it's pretty unusual, is it not, that a county could force the governor to come down and defend his decision. Okay, I'm going to try and pick up the pace here a little bit. Let me address the myths that surround the battle. The picture that was painted at that Virden Centennial I talked about in 1952 raised a lot of questions in my mind, and I decided to pursue the topic for all these years in between. That's a lot of years. But the picture portrayed of the miners was that they were striking miners who rioted when black coal miners suddenly appeared in town. Now I'd like to dissect this quickly. Were they striking miners? Well, first of all, the strike was over. It ended in April 1, 1898. Beyond that point, the Virden miners were locked out. The 800 people who came to Virden in support of the Virden miners were technically all back to work. So in my mind, there was not one striking miner at Virden on the day of the battle. Although some, including labor historians who should know better, have called this a battle between striking miners and guards. Not true. They were locked out, not on strike. They were back at work, the helpers. So I'm saying let's get it right. Let's say, tell it like it is, they were locked out miners. They were not striking miners at the battle. The Virden battle was known for years as the Virden Mine Riot. And it occurred to me eventually maybe 15 or 20 years ago, that's just not right. That's not the right word. A riot is something spontaneous. You don't plan a riot, it just kind of happens. Somebody provokes a riot. Riots in American history, social labor type riots, may occur for a reason unseen, and the end result is a bad situation, but they're not planned. And I would maintain the Virden mine battle was carefully planned by both sides. The 1,200 or so miners were armed, positioned like on a little battlefield in a pasture that remains pretty much the same as it did in 1898. They were ready and waiting for a train they knew was coming. The company had about 150 better armed guards, about 75 in the train and say 75 more in the stockade or fort just recently built around the mine. They too expected action that would happen when the train stopped at the mine site. It was a battle, not a riot, and let's get that right too. I had always heard that the train, the engineer was wounded, and I suppose if you were trying to stop the train, it would make sense for some of those 1,200 miners to be firing at the engineer. Well, they didn't kill him, but they wounded him pretty badly. He was eventually able to pull out, go to Springfield. Anyway, I lost my point for just a second, but I wanted to share with you a little piece of little known information is what I'm trying to say. The story has been all these years that the replacement workers were unable to land anybody at the Virden mine that day, but the truth of the matter is 6 did get off the train. I found a story in the Virden newspaper years ago that said those 6 were in town for about a month, worked at the mine long enough to pay their train fare up to Virden and back to Birmingham. Imagine they had to pay to come to a volatile situation. Again, supporting the idea, I think, that these fellows had been misled. I call them victims. I know it would be easier to say scabs, but I really feel like they really didn't have a handle on the situation. And in my mind, it's a little unfair to call them scabs. Was the battle about wages or race? If you go online and Google the Virden mine battle, one of the first 10 sites that comes up says, here's the complete story of the Virden race war. That really gets me going because in my mind, the battle was all about money. You've heard how 15 months of pain suffered by Virden miners and families. It seems to me if you hadn't been paid for 15 months and you'd been locked out, you'd be madder than hell at the company and not so much at the people who were duped into coming up to take your job. Okay, so let's address the racial thing for just a minute. Were the Virden miners fighting for an overdue pay hike after being on strike, then locked out for 15 months? Or were these 1,200 miners gathered to shoot at African Americans simply because they were just a bunch of racists? Forgetting their money grievances. Hardly, I would say. Again, we're talking about money, folks. Never mind the UMWA membership included African Americans from the start, and nearly 20,000 by 1900. That's a lot of black coal miners that were members of the UMWA shortly after the Virden mine battle. Never mind either that Virden was an integrated community, which surprises a lot of people, which included black miners, their families, and even a few students in Virden schools, all living peacefully. Note too that the fighting was between white guards and white miners. 13 whites were killed, no blacks, who were unarmed and ordered to hit the deck when the train reached Virden. The fight, again, was about money, not race, and let's get that right. It's my contention that the same battle would have been fought even if the replacement workers had been whites from, say, Michigan. The same thing was bound to happen. Okay, finally, let's talk about consequences or some legacies. First off, Union historians are pretty quick to point out that before Virden, fewer than half the coal miners in Illinois belonged to the Union. Shortly after Virden and the victory at Virden, as they promoted it properly, after Virden, more than half of the miners in Illinois were members of the UMWA. So it was a real good event for the UMWA. There was some legislation passed saying you couldn't bring in armed guards to Illinois and use them as law enforcement people and so forth. But I think there were three main legacies, and one of them we're standing in is the Union Miners Cemetery. 3 men from Mount Olive were killed at Virden, and when their bodies were brought back here the next day, as I understand from reading John Kaiser's nice little book on the cemetery, they were buried in the adjoining cemetery for about a year. About a year later, however, a group like this wanted to commemorate what those heroes had done at Virden, and they were getting flack from some of the people involved in putting that cemetery together. I'm not trying to be your local historian here. I'm primarily leaning on John Kaiser. Are any of you related to John, or do you know of him? A few, yeah. But he was quite a labor historian from this town. Eventually went on to become the president of Missouri State in Springfield, Missouri. Okay, so my point is that in 1899, the bodies of those 3 miners were moved to this newly created Union Miners Cemetery. And it has been expanded over the years. Mike Ketchmar's around and others who know the history of the cemetery. But in my mind, this cemetery is here because of the Virden mine battle. That's one of its greatest legacies, I believe. Mother Jones spoke here, get this, in 1923, where I'm standing, or somewhere nearby, at the 25th anniversary of the Virden mine battle, and said shortly thereafter she was so impressed with the story of Virden and Mount Olive that she wanted to be buried right here. Now, she didn't pass on until 1930, is that right? Yeah. But after she passed, she was buried here, and half a dozen years later, look what's behind me. The union that she had promoted throughout her life generated enough money. We built a monument on the scale of this, maybe a little less in Virden. It cost about $200,000. I have no idea what this is worth, but it's worth a lot more than that, I can tell you that. And it's amazing that Mother Jones, in my mind, is buried right here in central Illinois and in Macoupin County. And I would submit that she's buried here indirectly because of the Virden mine battle. She wanted to be buried next to those 3 guys whose names are on that flag. She considered to be martyrs of the Virden mine battle. And lastly, the annual event here at the cemetery started off as Virden Day. And over the years, that name changed a little bit. The time of year stuck with the Virden mine battle somewhere near October 12th. and we're close to that today, only 4 days off. Thursday's the actual anniversary. But the event, known originally again as Virden Day, has become known over the years as Miners' Day. It's good by me. I still like the connection directly to Virden. So the most interesting legacies in my mind are right here in front of us. The cemetery, Mother Jones, and you folks coming out annually to support Miners' Day, or in my mind I'll call it Virden Day, today on the 125th anniversary of that battle. Thank you.